The early morning fog clung to Margaret Wilson's garden like a gentle shroud, transforming her modest cottage at the edge of Oakwood into something from a watercolor painting. At 73, Margaret found peace in these quiet moments, watching the world awaken through the steam rising from her teacup. 20 years of widowhood had taught her to embrace solitude, to find comfort in the predictable rhythm of her days. This morning, however, brought something unexpected. A pair of amber eyes watched her from between the hydrangea bushes, patient, intelligent, and carrying a sadness that made Margaret's breath catch. The dog was thin, his golden-red coat dulled with dust and tangles, but there was a dignity in the way he held himself, sitting perfectly still as he observed her porch. "Hello there," Margaret called softly, setting her teacup down. The dog's ears perked, but he made no move to approach or flee. "Are you hungry?" She retreated inside, returning moments later with a bowl of water and leftover roast from Sunday dinner. Placing them at the bottom of her porch steps, she resumed her seat and waited. The dog watched, unmoving, for several minutes before finally standing. He approached with caution, each step deliberate, stopping several times to study Margaret's face before reaching the offerings. "That's it," she encouraged. "You're safe here." He drank thirstily, but took only a few bites of the meat before backing away, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something unnerving about his gaze, not threatening but penetrating, as though he were searching for something specific. "Are you lost?" Margaret asked, not expecting an answer but feeling compelled to speak to him. The dog tilted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. "Or are you looking for someone?" As if in response, the dog turned and trotted back to the edge of the property, disappearing into the morning mist as quietly as he had arrived. Margaret found herself standing, peering after him long after he'd vanished. Something about those sad eyes haunted her throughout the day as she went about her usual Tuesday routine, watering her plants, walking to the small local library where she volunteered 3 days a week, and stopping by Henderson's Market for her weekly groceries. "You look distracted today, Maggie," observed Eleanor Henderson, who at 68 still worked the register most mornings. "Everything all right?" "Just a visitor this morning," Margaret replied, selecting a loaf of sourdough. "A dog, thin but not starving, wearing a collar but no tags that I could see." Eleanor frowned. "Not old Roy Jenkins' retriever? Haven't seen that poor animal since Roy passed last month." "I don't think so," Margaret said. "This one had unusual coloring, like burnished copper, and the strangest eyes, and watching me like he knew me somehow." "Animals have a sense about people," Eleanor said, bagging Margaret's groceries. "Especially you soft-hearted types. You'll have him moved in by the weekend, mark my words." Margaret laughed. "I'm too set in my ways for a pet now. Besides, he didn't seem interested in staying." But the dog returned the next morning, and the next, always at dawn, always keeping his distance, always watching with those intelligent, sorrowful eyes. By the 4th day, Margaret had begun leaving food and water at the edge of her property, and each morning the bowls would be empty. On the 5th day, the skies opened up shortly after Margaret returned from her afternoon walk. The rain fell in sheets, pelting her windows and drowning out the sound of her favorite classical music program on the radio. As lightning flashed across the darkened sky, she thought of the golden dog and felt a twinge of worry. When the storm showed no signs of abating by evening, Margaret found herself standing at her front door, peering out into the deluge. A flash of lightning illuminated her yard, and there he was, huddled beneath her porch steps, soaked and shivering. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered, grabbing her raincoat and an old towel from the linen closet. Bracing herself, she stepped out into the storm. The dog watched her approach, but made no move to run. When she knelt beside him, murmuring gentle reassurances, he lowered his head slightly as if in surrender. Margaret draped the towel over him, rubbing gently to dry his fur. "You've been so patient, waiting out here," she said, noticing how he trembled under her touch. Not from fear, she realized, but exhaustion. "Let's get you inside and properly dried off." It was only when she placed her hand near his collar to guide him that she felt something unusual, not a tag, but what appeared to be a small leather pouch attached to the worn collar. The dog's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pause, his gaze seeming to communicate something beyond what she could understand. "What's this?" she murmured, her fingers working to unfasten the pouch in the dim light. "What have you been carrying?" The dog watched her unwaveringly, as she finally loosened the small package from his collar. For a moment, they remained there in the rain, the elderly woman and the mysterious dog, connected by this unexpected discovery. Then Margaret stood slowly. "Come," she said firmly, "let's get out of this weather before we both catch our death." To her surprise and relief, the dog followed her into the warmth of her home, leaving wet paw prints across her entryway rug. In the light of her living room, Margaret could see just how bedraggled he was, not just wet but bone-weary, as though he had travelled a great distance. "Let me see what you've been guarding so carefully," she said, settling into her armchair with the leather pouch. The dog sat at attention before her, watching as she carefully opened the weathered container. Inside was a folded photograph, its edges worn soft from handling, and a handwritten note on faded blue stationery. Margaret's hands trembled, slightly as she unfolded the photo first. An elderly man with kind eyes and a full head of white hair stood beside a younger woman with auburn hair, both smiling against the backdrop of what appeared to be a lighthouse. The note was brief. "His name is Cooper. Please help him find her. She needs to know the truth before it's too late." Margaret looked up from the note to find Cooper's eyes filled with what could only be described as tears, large droplets rolling silently down his muzzle. Without thinking, she reached out to stroke his damp head and found her own eyes filling with tears in response. "Oh, Cooper," she whispered, "what journey have you been on, dear heart? And what truth are you carrying?" As the storm raged outside, Margaret Wilson felt something shift within her carefully ordered world. The sad-eyed dog had brought more than just his physical presence into her home. He had brought a mystery, a purpose, and something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, a companionship that transcended words. "Well," she said finally, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "we'll sort this out together, won't we?" Cooper rested his head on her knee, closing his eyes with what seemed like profound relief. For the first time since he'd appeared in her garden, the sadness in his gaze had lifted, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret placed a bowl of scrambled eggs beside Cooper's water dish. The dog had slept through the night on the braided rug beside her bed, his exhaustion evident in the depth of his slumber. Now cleaned and dried, his copper coat gleamed, revealing a handsome animal of indeterminate age, not young, but vital nonetheless. "You're quite the gentleman this morning," Margaret observed as Cooper waited politely for her nod before eating. "Someone loved you very much." The photograph and note lay on her kitchen table beside her reading glasses and morning crossword. She had studied them late into the night, searching for clues. The lighthouse in the background seemed familiar, possibly Cape Harmony Light, about 40 miles up the coast. The handwriting was shaky but determined, likely belonging to the elderly man in the photograph. But who was the woman Cooper needed to find, and what truth awaited her? The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her thoughts. It was Eleanor Henderson, whose curiosity had always been as reliable as the tides. "So, did the mystery dog return?" Eleanor asked without preamble. "He did," Margaret replied, watching as Cooper finished his breakfast and began to explore the kitchen with cautious interest. "His name is Cooper, and he's carrying quite the enigma." "I knew it." Eleanor's delight carried through the line. "You've adopted him already?" "Not exactly," Margaret hedged. "I think he's on a mission of sorts." "Eleanor, do you remember if Roy Jenkins ever mentioned family up around Cape Harmony?" "Cape Harmony? No? Can't say that he did, but Dr. Sullivan might know. He was Roy's physician and friend." "Why do you ask?" Margaret hesitated, uncertain how much to share. "Just something I'm looking into. Is Dr. Sullivan still at the same practice?" "Semi-retired now, only comes in Tuesdays and Thursdays. Speaking of which, aren't you due for a checkup? Your arthritis bothering you again?" Margaret smiled at her friend's transparent attempt to extract more information. "My joints are just fine, thank you. I'll call his office later." After ending the call, Margaret noticed Cooper sitting by the back door, his intent gaze alternating between her and the doorknob. "Need to go out?" she asked, rising to open the door. To her surprise, Cooper didn't immediately run to relieve himself in the garden. Instead, he looked up at her, then out toward the path that led to town, then back at her again. "You want me to follow you?" Margaret asked, a chill running down her spine despite the warm June morning. Cooper gave a soft woof, the first sound she'd heard him make. "Let me get my walking shoes." 10 minutes later, Margaret found herself following Cooper along the familiar path into Oakwood. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was still following. They passed Henderson's Market, where Eleanor waved enthusiastically from the window, and continued past the library and town hall. Cooper finally stopped outside the small medical practice where Dr. James Sullivan had served the community for nearly 4 decades. He sat expectantly, looking from Margaret to the door. "Well, I'll be," Margaret murmured. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" The receptionist, a young woman Margaret didn't recognize, looked up with a smile as they entered. "Mrs. Wilson, and who's this handsome fellow?" "This is Cooper," Margaret replied, noting how the dog remained perfectly behaved, sitting at attention beside her. "Is Dr. Sullivan in today? I was hoping to speak with him briefly." "You're in luck. He just finished with his last morning appointment. I'll let him know you're here." Minutes later, Dr. Sullivan appeared in the waiting room doorway. At 76, he remained remarkably spry, though his once dark hair had long since turned silver. "Margaret, what a pleasant surprise, and who's your companion?" Before Margaret could answer, Cooper rose and approached the doctor, his tail wagging tentatively. Dr. Sullivan's expression shifted from pleasant surprise to shock. "Cooper?" he whispered, kneeling despite his age to stroke the dog's head. "My God, it is you. Where have you been, old boy? We've been so worried." Margaret stood frozen, trying to process this unexpected connection. "You know him?" Dr. Sullivan looked up, his eyes bright with emotion. "He belonged to my dear friend Thomas Whitfield, the lighthouse keeper at Cape Harmony, until his passing 2 months ago. Cooper disappeared the day of the funeral. We assumed he'd run off to die himself, as loyal. Dogs sometimes do." Margaret reached into her handbag, withdrawing the leather pouch. He was carrying this. Dr. Sullivan accepted the pouch with trembling hands, his breath catching as he examined the contents. "Thomas's handwriting," he confirmed. "And this photo taken the last time Elizabeth visited the lighthouse, I'd guess." "Elizabeth? Thomas's daughter. They've been estranged for years, since her mother's death. There was misunderstanding." Cooper watched them intently, his eyes moving between their faces as if following the conversation. "The note says Cooper needs to find her, that she needs to know the truth," Margaret said. "What truth, Dr. Sullivan?" The doctor sighed heavily, returning the items to the pouch. "That's not for me to say, Margaret, but I can tell you Elizabeth lives in Boston now, married name's Campbell. She never knew how her father watched over her from afar all these years." Margaret felt a surge of determination, unlike anything she'd experienced in years. "Cooper found me for a reason," she said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "I think I'm meant to help him complete his journey." Dr. Sullivan studied her thoughtfully. "Thomas always said Cooper was the wisest soul he'd ever known. If he chose you, there's purpose in it." He hesitated. "Elizabeth should know about her father's passing, regardless of their differences. Perhaps." "I'll need her address," Margaret said simply. "Cooper and I have a truth to deliver." The doctor's eyebrows rose. "You're planning to go to Boston?" "Margaret, that's a 3-hour train ride. At your age—" "At my age," she interrupted with a smile, "I've learned not to waste time when something important needs doing." Dr. Sullivan's expression softened. "I'll make some calls, get her current information. But Margaret, you should know, Elizabeth Campbell isn't an easy woman. Grief and guilt hardened her years ago. Neither was her father, I imagine, living alone in that lighthouse all those years," Margaret replied, stroking Cooper's head. "But he had enough love to send his most faithful companion to find her. That says something worth honoring, don't you think?" As they left the clinic with Elizabeth Campbell's address written on a prescription pad, Margaret felt a curious lightness in her step. For years her days had followed the same comfortable pattern, predictable, safe, and increasingly hollow. Now, with each pace Cooper took beside her, she felt the stirring of something she'd almost forgotten. Purpose. "We have a lot to prepare," she told the dog as they walked home. "Boston isn't Oakwood. We'll need to figure out transportation, accommodations." Cooper responded with a dignified stride, his sad eyes now bright with what could only be described as determination. Whatever secret he carried from Thomas Whitfield to his daughter, Margaret Wilson had become an essential part of its delivery. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, tomorrow held mystery instead of routine. The train rocked gently as it sped toward Boston, the countryside blurring into streaks of summer green and gold. Margaret sat with her back straight against the worn upholstery, a small overnight bag tucked securely at her feet, and Cooper lying beside her seat. She had called in a favor with the station master, an old friend of her late husband, who had arranged for Cooper to travel in the passenger car rather than with the luggage. "He's a service dog of sorts," she had explained, stretching the truth only slightly. After all, wasn't Cooper serving a profound purpose? The conductor had raised his eyebrows but asked no questions when he saw the elderly woman and her dignified companion. Cooper had sat at perfect attention, as if understanding the ruse required his best behavior. Now, 3 hours into their journey, Margaret studied the notepad in her lap. Dr. Sullivan had been more helpful than she dared hope, providing not only Elizabeth Campbell's address in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, but also a brief history that filled some gaps in the mysterious tale. Thomas Whitfield had become the keeper at Cape Harmony Light after a distinguished career as a maritime engineer. Following his wife Catherine's death in a boating accident 27 years ago, he had retreated to the solitary life of a lighthouse keeper, taking the position that few wanted in an age of automation. His daughter Elizabeth, just 22 at the time, had blamed her father for her mother's death, believing he should have better maintained the family sailboat that capsized in a sudden squall. The investigation cleared Thomas completely, Dr. Sullivan had explained. It was a freak accident, no one's fault, but Elizabeth needed someone to blame, and Thomas in his grief accepted that burden. Cooper stirred at Margaret's feet, raising his head to look out the window as the train began to slow. The outskirts of Boston came into view, first industrial, buildings, then gradually the denser architecture of the city proper. "Almost there," Margaret murmured, stroking the dog's silky ear. "Are you nervous?" "I certainly am." Cooper responded by resting his chin on her knee, his amber eyes full of what seemed like reassurance. Margaret had never been one to anthropomorphize animals, but over the past 3 days she had found herself increasingly convinced of Cooper's understanding. He wasn't just carrying a message, he seemed to comprehend its importance. The train pulled into South Station amid steam and the screech of brakes. Margaret gathered her belongings and nodded to Cooper, who stood at attention, ready to navigate the crowded platform. She had decided against calling Elizabeth in advance, fearing the woman might refuse to see her. Better to arrive unannounced, letting Cooper make the introduction that no human could possibly deny. "Back bay, please," she instructed the taxi driver outside the station. She had splurged on a modest hotel room not far from Elizabeth's address, recognizing that this mission might require more than a single day. The hotel clerk raised no objection to Cooper, particularly after Margaret slipped him an extra $20 with her credit card. By mid-afternoon, she was settled in a clean, if unremarkable, room with windows overlooking Commonwealth Avenue's leafy expanse. "We should rest before we attempt to find her," Margaret told Cooper, easing into an armchair. "Neither of us is as young as we once were." The dog seemed to agree, curling onto the carpet beside her chair with a deep sigh. Within minutes, his breathing had slowed into sleep, his paws occasionally twitching as he dreamed. Margaret found herself wondering what memories lived behind those expressive eyes, of Thomas Whitfield, of the lighthouse, of whatever journey had brought him to her garden that foggy morning. She must have dozed herself, for when she next opened her eyes, the room was bathed in the golden light of early evening. Cooper stood by the door, his posture alert. "Time to go?" she asked, glancing at her watch. 6:30, not too late for a social call. "All right then." Elizabeth Campbell's address led them to a narrow brownstone on a quieter side street of Beacon Hill. Window boxes spilled over with red geraniums, and brass house numbers gleamed against freshly painted trim. It was a home that spoke of prosperity and careful maintenance, a stark contrast to the isolated lighthouse where Elizabeth's father had spent his final decades. As they approached the steps, Cooper's demeanor changed subtly. His ears pricked forward, and his pace quickened with newfound energy. "He knows we're close," Margaret thought, feeling her heart begin to race. What would they say to this woman, who had spent half her lifetime nursing old grief? Margaret took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell, copper bright against the blue door. Cooper sat perfectly at her side, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Seconds stretched into a full minute. Margaret was about to ring again when they heard footsteps within. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 50s, with striking auburn hair streaked with silver and eyes the color of stormy seas. She wore tailored slacks and a crisp white blouse, the outfit of someone who had perhaps just returned from a professional setting. "Yes?" Elizabeth Campbell's voice was pleasant but reserved, her gaze moving from Margaret to Cooper with polite curiosity. Then, as she looked more closely at the dog, her expression froze. The color drained from her face. That's not possible," she whispered. Cooper rose slowly, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. He made no move to approach, instead looking up at Elizabeth with quiet intensity. "Mrs. Campbell," Margaret began, "my name is Margaret Wilson. I believe this remarkable dog belonged to your father. His name is Cooper." Elizabeth gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "I know who he is," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "But my father died 2 months ago. Cooper disappeared." "He found me," Margaret explained gently, "at my home in Oakwood, nearly 40 miles from Cape Harmony. He was carrying something meant for you." For a long moment Elizabeth stood immobile, trapped between the impulse to shut the door and the undeniable pull of the dog's presence. Finally, she stepped back. "You'd better come in," she said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. The interior of the brownstone was as impeccable as its exterior, furnished with antiques and original artwork that spoke of refined taste and the means to indulge it. Elizabeth led them to a sitting room overlooking a small, meticulously maintained garden. "Would you like tea?" she asked mechanically, her social training asserting itself despite her evident shock. "No, thank you," Margaret replied, settling onto a brocade sofa. Cooper remained standing, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth. "I think it's best if I explain why we're here." Elizabeth perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture rigid. "He looks exactly the same," she murmured, finally allowing herself to truly look at Cooper. "Dad got him as a puppy. Right after—" She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Right after I stopped speaking to him." Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew the leather pouch, now carefully wrapped in tissue paper for protection. "Cooper was wearing this when he came to me. I believe your father sent him to find you." Elizabeth accepted the package with visibly trembling hands. As she unwrapped it and slid out the photograph, a small sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a sob. "This was taken 9 years ago," she said, tracing the image with her fingertip. "The only time I visited him at the lighthouse. My husband insisted we stop while vacationing on the coast. It was strained." She unfolded the note next, her eyes widening as she read the simple message. "Please help him. Find her. She needs to know the truth before it's too late," she recited, looking up with confusion. "What truth? And it is too late." "He's gone." Margaret shook her head. "I don't know what truth he meant, but Cooper traveled a very long way to deliver that message. Whatever your father wanted you to know, he considered it important enough to entrust to his most faithful companion." Elizabeth's composure cracked, her eyes filling with tears. "And Cooper found you instead of me. What does that say about the choices I've made?" As if in response, Cooper finally approached her, resting his muzzle lightly on her knee. Large drops rolled silently from his amber eyes, matching the tears now streaming down Elizabeth's face. "I think," Margaret said softly, "that Cooper found exactly who he needed to find in exactly the order required. He came to me because I could help him reach you. And now, perhaps we can discover together what your father wanted you to know." Elizabeth buried her face in Cooper's fur, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I was so angry for so long," she whispered, "and now he's gone, and I can never tell him I'm sorry." Margaret felt like an intruder, witnessing such raw grief, but also recognized that her journey with Cooper was not yet complete. "Your father lived at the lighthouse until the end?" she asked gently. Elizabeth nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, refused to retire, even when the Coast Guard automated everything. They let him stay on as caretaker." She looked down at Cooper, who had settled at her feet. "He must have sent Cooper away right before. Did Dad know he was dying?" "Dr. Sullivan mentioned your father had a heart condition," Margaret offered. "Perhaps he sensed his time was short." "James Sullivan," Elizabeth said with a sad smile. "Dad's oldest friend. He tried to mediate between us for years, until I told him to stop." She looked up suddenly. "Does James know you're here?" "He provided your address," Margaret he confirmed. "He thought you should know about Cooper, regardless of the past." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Cooper's head. "The note says, 'the truth,'" she finally said. "After nearly 30 years, what truth could possibly matter now?" Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Margaret awakened to a soft whining. Cooper stood by the hotel room door, his posture alert and expectant. "It's 5:30, Margaret groaned, squinting at the bedside clock. "Surely Elizabeth isn't expecting us this early." But Cooper's insistence was unmistakable. He paced between Margaret and the door, occasionally returning to tug gently at the sleeve of her nightgown. Whatever urgency drove him, it would not wait for a more civilized hour. "All right," she sighed, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Give me 15 minutes to make myself presentable." By 6 o'clock, they were walking through the quiet streets of Beacon Hill. The city had a different quality at this hour, peaceful, expectant, the harshness of its edges softened by morning light. Cooper led the way with confidence, turning corners without hesitation, as if following an invisible map. To Margaret's surprise, they did not return to Elizabeth's brownstone, but continued past it toward the public garden. Cooper paused at the garden's entrance, looking back at Margaret as if to confirm she was still following. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, receiving only an intent gaze in response. They found Elizabeth seated on a bench near the lagoon, wrapped in a light cardigan against the morning chill. She appeared to have been there for some time, her face bearing the hollow-eyed look of one who had spent the night in deep thought rather than sleep. She showed no surprise at their appearance. "He used to do this with Dad," she said, as Cooper approached and placed his head on her knee. "Wake him at dawn for their morning walk, no matter the weather." "He was quite insistent," Margaret agreed, settling beside Elizabeth on the bench. "I don't think he would have taken no for an answer." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the first joggers of the day circle the garden paths and early commuters hurry toward downtown. "I made a decision last night," Elizabeth finally said. "I'm going to Cape Harmony today, to the lighthouse. I need to see where he spent his last years." She glanced sideways at Margaret. "Would you and Cooper come with me? I know it's presumptuous to ask, after you've already done so much, but of course we'll come," Margaret said without hesitation. The rightness of it settled in her chest like a warm stone. "I think that's what Cooper's been guiding us toward all along." Elizabeth nodded, a hint of relief softening her features. "I've arranged for a car. We can leave whenever you're ready." 2 hours later, they were heading north along the coast in a sleek sedan, driven by a taciturn man who asked no questions about their unusual party. Cooper sat regally in the back seat between the two women, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as if counting the miles. "I haven't been to Cape Harmony since that visit in the photograph," Elizabeth admitted, as the city gave way to coastal villages and stretches of protected shoreline. 9 years avoiding a place that was once my favorite in the world." "You spent time there as a child?" Margaret asked. "Every summer until college. Mum and Dad would rent the old keeper's cottage before Dad took the position permanently. It was paradise then. Secret coves to explore, tide pools teeming with creatures, the constant rhythm of the waves." Elizabeth's voice softened with memory. "After Mom died, I couldn't bear to return. Too many ghosts." Cooper shifted slightly, pressing his warm flank against Elizabeth's leg as if offering comfort. "Tell me about your mother," Margaret prompted gently. "Dr. Sullivan mentioned she died in a sailing accident?" Elizabeth tensed. Momentarily, then exhaled slowly. "Catherine Whitfield, brilliant marine biologist, fearless sailor, and the center of our world. She took a research vessel out during what was supposed to be a mild squall. The storm intensified unexpectedly, and the boat capsized." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They found her body 3 days later." "And you blamed your father?" "He designed modifications for that boat," Elizabeth said, an echo of old anger surfacing. "I was convinced he'd made some fatal error, that his work had failed her when she needed it most. The investigation cleared him, but I couldn't accept it. I needed someone to blame." Cooper made a soft sound, almost a sigh, and Elizabeth unconsciously stroked his head. "The hardest truths to face are often the ones that implicate ourselves," Margaret observed. "I spent years angry at my husband for dying and leaving me alone, before I could acknowledge that my anger was really fear disguised." Elizabeth regarded her with newfound respect. "You're very wise, Mrs. Wilson." "Margaret, please, and not wise. Just old enough to have made plenty of mistakes and eventually learned from them." The conversation lapsed into thoughtful silence as the car turned onto a narrow peninsula. Ahead, Cape Harmony Light stood against the blue sky, its white tower gleaming in the midday sun. Nestled at its base was a grey-shingled cottage with crimson trim, weathered but well-maintained. "It looks exactly the same," Elizabeth murmured as they approached, "as if the last 30 years never happened." The car stopped in the gravel drive, and Cooper was out the moment Elizabeth opened the door, bounding toward the cottage with newfound energy. He stopped at the front door, looking back expectantly. "The key used to be kept under the blue flower pot," Elizabeth said, approaching slowly. She lifted a faded ceramic planter to reveal a tarnished key. Some things never change. Inside, the cottage was clean, but obviously unoccupied. Sheets draped the furniture, and the air had the still quality of rooms too long unopened. Cooper moved through the space with familiarity, his nails clicking against the worn wooden floors as he led them toward a closed door at the back of the main room. "Dad's study," Elizabeth explained, her hand hesitating on the doorknob. "It was off-limits when I was young, filled with his technical drawings and engineering papers." When she finally pushed the door open, however, the room beyond was nothing like the forbidden workspace of her childhood. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, forming a timeline that spanned decades, and every single image featured Elizabeth. There she was, graduating from high school, then college, receiving her master's degree, at her wedding, in front of her first apartment, her first house, with colleagues at what appeared to be professional events, always photographed from a distance, as if the photographer had been present but uninvited. "He was watching over me," Elizabeth whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of a frame containing a photo of her cradling her firstborn son. "All those years I thought he'd forgotten me." He was there. Cooper sat in the center of the room, surrounded by the evidence of Thomas Whitfield's enduring love for his daughter. His eyes held a satisfaction that confirmed for Margaret that they had reached a crucial part of their journey. "He never stopped being your father," Margaret said softly. "Even when you stopped being his daughter." Elizabeth turned to her, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "But why didn't he tell me? Why the silence all these years?" The answer seemed to lie in the room itself, in the patient documentation of a life observed from afar, in the quiet dignity of love that asked for nothing in return. But Cooper wasn't finished with his mission. He moved to a roll-top desk in the corner, pawing gently at its closed surface. Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands to reveal a leather-bound journal resting on the polished wood. The bookmark protruding from its pages was a faded photograph of Catherine Whitfield, smiling aboard the very vessel that would eventually claim her life. "I think," Margaret said gently, "we're about to discover the truth your father wanted you to know." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she lifted the journal from the desk. The leather was soft with age and handling, its edges worn smooth by years of touch. Cooper watched her intently, his amber eyes never leaving her face as she carefully opened the cover. "For Elizabeth," she read aloud, her voice catching on her own name. "When you're ready to hear the truth." She looked up, eyes glistening. "He knew I would come eventually." Margaret settled into a nearby chair, sensing that whatever revelations the journal contained, Elizabeth would need both space and support to process them. Cooper moved to sit between them, a silent guardian of this moment. The first entry was dated 2 days after Catherine Whitfield's funeral, nearly 3 decades earlier. Elizabeth began to read, her voice strengthening as she gave life to her father's words. "I have lost everything. My beloved Catherine is gone, and with her, my daughter's love. Elizabeth believes I am responsible for the accident, and perhaps she is right. Not in the way she thinks. The boat's design was sound, but I was the one who encouraged Catherine's research that day, despite the weather. Warnings. I told her the storm wouldn't be severe. My confidence killed her, and now my daughter cannot bear the sight of me. I will respect her need for distance, but I will not abandon my vigil. From afar, I will watch over her as I failed to watch over her mother." Elizabeth paused, pressing a hand to her mouth. "He never told me he was the one who encouraged Mom to go out that day." "Would it have mattered then?" Margaret asked gently. "In your grief, would you have forgiven him any more readily for that than for a design flaw?" "No," Elizabeth admitted after a moment of reflection. "I needed a villain, and he accepted that role." She continued reading, flipping through pages that chronicled her father's self-imposed exile to the lighthouse and his commitment to tracking her life from a distance. He had employed a private investigator initially, then developed a network of friends and acquaintances who would subtly keep him informed of her milestones. The photographs on the walls had been taken during careful, brief ventures into her world, always at the periphery, never close enough to be noticed. Elizabeth graduated with honors today, she read from an entry marked 25 years earlier. I sat in the last row of the auditorium, left before the ceremony ended. She has chosen environmental law, perhaps influenced by her mother's commitment to marine conservation. Catherine would be so proud. I wish I could tell our daughter this myself. Cooper shifted, resting his chin on Elizabeth's knee as tears splashed onto the pages. She stroked his head absently, continuing to read passages that documented her father's unwavering love and his acceptance of her anger. He had attended her wedding, standing outside the church to glimpse her in her bridal gown. He had seen both her sons as infants, visiting the hospital nursery during off hours when he knew she would be resting in her room. All those years, Elizabeth whispered. I thought he had forgotten. Me moved on without a backward glance. Instead, he was always there, loving me from the shadows. She turned to entries from the past decade, where the handwriting had begun to show signs of age and increasing frailty. She found the date of her brief visit to the lighthouse 9 years ago, the visit captured in the photograph Cooper had carried. Elizabeth came today, she read, voice breaking. 9 hours that I will cherish for the rest of my days. She is still angry, still hurt, but she came. We spoke of neutral topics, her work, the lighthouse renovations, Cooper's antics. Not of Catherine, not of the accident, not of the years between us. But she allowed me to take a photograph with her, standing by the rose bushes Catherine planted. It is the greatest gift I could have received. Perhaps someday, before my heart fails completely, there will be time for the truth. Margaret watched as understanding slowly dawned across Elizabeth's face. His heart, she murmured. Dr. Sullivan mentioned a condition. With renewed urgency, Elizabeth flipped to the final entries. The last was dated just 3 days before Thomas Whitfield's death. The doctor says my time is measured now in days, not weeks. I have made my peace with death, but not with leaving Elizabeth still burdened by anger she does not need to carry. I have written her a letter explaining everything about that day, not to absolve myself, but to free her. Cooper knows what to do. My faithful friend has always been wiser than most humans I've known. He will find her when I am gone, or he will find someone who can help him reach her. I trust in his heart, as I trust in Elizabeth's. May they both forgive an old man who lacked the courage to bridge the divide when there was still time. Elizabeth closed the journal, holding it against her chest as if embracing the father she had rejected for so many years. Cooper whined softly, nudging her hand with his nose. He mentioned a letter, Margaret prompted gently. Perhaps there's more to find. Cooper stood immediately, moving with purpose toward a seascape painting hanging on the far wall. He sat beneath it, looking back with expectation. Elizabeth approached and carefully removed the painting to reveal a small wall safe. The combination was always Mom's birthday, she said, fingers moving over the dial with certainty born of childhood memory. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing several envelopes, legal documents, and a small velvet pouch. Elizabeth withdrew an envelope with her name written across it in a shaky hand. Unlike the journal entries, this appeared to have been written very near the end of Thomas's life. She opened it with reverent care, unfolding several pages of handwritten text. My dearest Elizabeth, she began, then faltered, unable to continue. Margaret rose from her chair. Would you like some privacy? Elizabeth shook her head. No, please stay. You and Cooper, you're part of this journey now. She took a deep breath and continued reading. My dearest Elizabeth, if you are reading this, then Cooper has fulfilled his final mission for me, and you have found your way back to Cape Harmony. There are no words to express my gratitude for this moment, even knowing I will not be present to witness it. I must tell you the complete truth about your mother's death, a truth I have carried alone for 27 years. On the morning of the accident, Catherine and I argued about her research expedition. The Weather Service had issued small craft warnings, but she was determined to collect time-sensitive data. I insisted it was too dangerous. We exchanged harsh words, the kind that loving couples sometimes do, secure in the knowledge they will soon be forgiven and forgotten. Catherine left in anger. My last words to her were, at least take the research vessel instead of our sailboat. It's better equipped for rough seas. She followed this advice, the only part of our exchange I didn't regret. But in her determination to prove me overprotective, she pushed farther from shore than planned. When the unexpected squall hit, she was too far out to return safely. I did not encourage her trip that day. I opposed it. But in the aftermath, when you needed someone to blame, I saw the relief it gave you to hold me responsible. You needed that anchor for your grief, and I would have given you anything to ease your pain. So I accepted your anger, allowed you to believe I had urged her to go, or that my modifications to the research vessel had somehow failed her. The investigation confirmed what I already knew. Nothing could have saved Catherine once that storm intensified. No design, no captain, no vessel could have survived those conditions where she found herself. It was a tragic confluence of nature's power and human determination. I do not share this now to change your memory of your mother. She was exactly as you remember, brilliant and fearless to a fault. Nor do I seek to absolve myself of guilt. I will always wonder if a different approach that morning might have changed her mind. I tell you this only so that you may finally set down the burden of blame you've carried for so long. Blame is a heavy companion through life, my darling girl. It dulls joy and deepens sorrow. Catherine would not have wanted this for you, this anger that has kept you from the shore she loved, from the father who has loved you every moment of every day since you drew your first breath. Whatever you feel upon reading these words, relief, disbelief, renewed anger, know that I understand. Your journey is your own now. My only wish is that someday you might return to Cape Harmony, not as a place of sorrow, but as the sanctuary your mother and I once created for our little family. The lighthouse and cottage are yours now, along with everything I possess. Cooper, my most faithful friend, I entrust to your care, though I suspect he has already claimed a place in your heart, as he has in mine. I have loved you perfectly, if distantly. Forgive me, if you can, for lacking the courage to force this truth upon you sooner. Sometimes love means waiting for the beloved to find their own way home. Always and forever yours, Dad. Elizabeth lowered the letter, her tears falling freely now. Cooper pressed against her legs, offering silent comfort. Outside the window, sunlight danced on the waves of the Atlantic, the same waters that had claimed her mother nearly 3 decades earlier. He let me hate him, she whispered. All these years, he accepted my anger because he thought it helped me cope with losing her. Some people, Margaret said softly, express their love not in what they demand, but in what they're willing to endure. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lighthouse grounds as Elizabeth wandered through the cottage, Cooper loyally at her heels. Each room held memories, some preserved exactly as she remembered from childhood, others transformed by her father's solitary decades of residence. In the kitchen, copper pots still hung in the same arrangement her mother had preferred. In the living room, her father's reading chair faced the ocean, a book of poetry open on the side table beside a pair of reading glasses, as if he had just stepped out momentarily. Margaret observed quietly from the porch, giving Elizabeth space to rediscover the home that had shaped her early years. Through the open windows, she could hear occasional comments directed at Cooper. He kept Mom's gardening books, or remember this view, Cooper. Dad said it was the most beautiful in the world. The dog responded with soft woofs of acknowledgement, seemingly understanding the significance of this homecoming. In the kitchen garden, Margaret noticed seaside roses blooming in profusion, the same variety visible in the photograph Cooper had carried across 40 miles of countryside. When Elizabeth finally joined her on the porch, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear, her expression more peaceful than it had been since they'd met. "Thank you," she said simply, settling into the weathered Adirondack chair beside Margaret. "I've done very little," Margaret replied. "Cooper is the one who brought you home." Elizabeth smiled, watching as the dog investigated a seagull's tracks in the sandy path leading to the beach. "You both did. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to come back here alone, even with Cooper's guidance." She paused, her gaze moving to the horizon where sea met sky in a seamless blue expanse. "I've been thinking about what happens next." "Oh?" Margaret kept her tone neutral, though she felt a flutter of curiosity. "I always assumed Dad left the lighthouse to the Historical Society or the Coast Guard. Learning that it's mine now, it changes things." Elizabeth's fingers traced the weathered arm of the chair. "I have a good life in Boston. Successful career, comfortable home. My sons are in college now, starting their own journeys. But sitting here, I can feel something I haven't felt in years. And what's that? Possibility, Elizabeth said softly. My firm has been after me to reduce my caseload, take on more mentoring of junior associates. I could work remotely part of the week, spend more time here. She glanced at Margaret. What do you think? Is it crazy to consider dividing my life between two worlds? Margaret considered the question carefully. I don't think it's crazy at all. Sometimes bridges need to be built not just between people, but between parts of ourselves we've kept separate. Cooper returned to the porch, shaking sand from his coat before settling at Elizabeth's feet with a contented sigh. And what about you? Elizabeth asked. Your life is in Oakwood. Will you be ready to return tomorrow? The question caught Margaret by surprise. In the whirlwind of the past few days, she had thought little about her own return journey. The rhythm of her carefully ordered days in Oakwood seemed distant now, like a half-remembered dream. I suppose I should, she said slowly. My neighbor is watering my plants and the library will be wondering where I've disappeared to. But, Elizabeth prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. Margaret smiled ruefully. But I'm finding I'm not quite ready for this adventure to end. Selfish of me, perhaps. Not selfish, human. We all need purpose, connection. Elizabeth straightened suddenly. Stay a few more days. Help me sort through Dad's things. Decide what to weigh. Keep. What to donate. I could use the company of someone who understands this journey. The invitation warmed Margaret in unexpected ways. Since her husband's death, she had grown accustomed to being needed in small, practical ways. Her volunteer work at the library, her occasional babysitting for neighbors' grandchildren. But this was different. A need that acknowledged her wisdom, her companionship, her presence as valuable in itself. I'd like that, she said simply. They spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the lighthouse keeper's quarters at the base of the tower. Thomas had maintained the historical accuracy of the small apartment while adding modest modern comforts, a compact refrigerator, a space heater for winter nights, shelves lined with books on maritime history and engineering. Elizabeth discovered her father's logbooks, meticulously recording weather patterns, maintenance tasks, and occasional rescue efforts over the years. He saved 3 lives during his tenure, she noted, reading an entry from 15 years earlier. A pleasure craft capsized during a sudden squall. Dad spotted them from the tower and radioed for Coast Guard assistance, then took the rescue boat out himself. Like mother, like daughter, Margaret observed. Your environmental law work, it's an extension of your mother's conservation efforts, isn't it? Elizabeth looked up, surprised. I never thought of it that way, but yes. My specialty is prosecuting corporate polluters who damage marine ecosystems. She smiled sadly. I've spent my career defending the waters that took her from us. As dusk approached, they returned to the cottage. Elizabeth discovered a well-stocked pantry and freezer. Her father had clearly prepared for the possibility of her arrival, even as his health failed. She prepared a simple dinner of pasta and sauce, while Margaret brewed tea in Catherine's floral teapot, still kept in its place of honor on the kitchen shelf. Cooper moved between them, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting someone else to arrive. His behavior grew increasingly restless as the evening deepened, until finally he stood at the door, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Elizabeth asked, opening the door to the star-filled night. Cooper bounded out, heading toward the path that wound around the lighthouse to the small private beach beyond. Elizabeth grabbed a flashlight from the hook by the door. We should follow him. They found Cooper at the water's edge, sitting at attention, his gaze fixed on the gentle waves lapping the shore. As they approached, the beam of the flashlight caught something unusual. A small rowboat pulled up on the sand, and beside it, the figure of an elderly man. "Hello?" Elizabeth called, a note of alarm in her voice. "Who's there?" The figure turned, and in the flashlight's beam they could see a weather-beaten face topped with a shock of white hair. "Elizabeth Campbell?" the man asked, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of a lifelong Maine resident. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Who are you?" "Name's Harlan Mackenzie. I was your father's friend." The old man's gaze moved to Cooper, who had approached to sniff his outstretched hand. "Glad to see this old boy made it back home." "You knew Cooper would return?" Margaret asked. Harlan nodded, patting the dog's head with obvious affection. "Thomas told me his plan before he passed. Said Cooper would bring his daughter home when the time was. Right. His rheumy eyes studied Elizabeth's face. You look like your mother. Catherine had that same determined expression. Elizabeth's posture softened slightly. How did you know my parents? I've fished these waters for 60 years, Harlan explained. Your father and I became friends after he took the lighthouse position. Two solitary old men with more past than future. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wooden box. Thomas asked me to deliver this if Cooper succeeded in bringing you back. Said to wait a decent interval, to give you time to read his letter. Elizabeth accepted the box with trembling hands. It was beautifully crafted of maple wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a wave pattern along the edges. What is it? Harlan shrugged. Not for me to say. Thomas had his secrets, same as we all do. He glanced up at the lighthouse, its beam now cutting through the darkness above them. He never stopped hoping you'd return. Said the light wasn't just for the ships. It was to help you find your way back when you were ready. With a nod to both women, he turned and began pushing his rowboat back into the water. I'll be off now. Just wanted to fulfill my promise to an old friend. They watched as he rowed away, his small craft soon swallowed by the darkness. Cooper sat contentedly now, as if another piece of his mission had fallen into place. Back in the cottage, Elizabeth placed the wooden box on the kitchen table, studying it from all angles before, carefully lifting the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay her mother's wedding ring and a small golden key. The ring I recognize, she said, lifting it reverently. But this key... Cooper nudged her hand, directing her attention back to the box. Beneath the velvet lining was a folded slip of paper. Elizabeth removed it and read aloud. For the chest in the lighthouse lantern room, some lights need to be tended in person. Margaret watched understanding dawn on Elizabeth's face. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse? Elizabeth nodded, already reaching for her jacket and the flashlight. Dad always said the best view was from the top. We need to go now. The spiral staircase within the lighthouse wound skyward like the interior of a nautilus shell, each step worn smooth by generations of keepers. Elizabeth led the way, her flashlight beam dancing across whitewashed walls. Cooper followed eagerly, his paws making little sound on the metal treads while Margaret ascended more carefully, one hand on the railing. 108 steps, Elizabeth said, her voice echoing in the confined space. I counted them every time as a child. Dad said it was like climbing toward the stars. The lantern room at the summit was circular, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of darkness, interrupted only by distant pinpricks of light from fishing vessels and the scattered homes along the coastline. The great Fresnel lens at the center rotated. Silently, powered now by electricity rather than the kerosene of earlier eras, its beam swept across the water in a steady rhythm. 3 seconds of brilliance, 3 seconds of waiting, a heartbeat of light and darkness repeated through the night. It's magnificent, Margaret murmured, slightly breathless from the climb, like standing inside a star. Elizabeth moved around the perimeter of the small room, her fingers trailing along the polished brass fixtures. Cooper sat before a wooden sea, chest tucked beneath the small desk where lighthouse keepers had once recorded their observations. The dog's eyes moved meaningfully between Elizabeth and the chest. I think we've found what the key unlocks, Elizabeth said, kneeling beside the weathered trunk. The brass lock gleamed in the alternating light and shadow as the beacon rotated above them. With hands that trembled slightly, she inserted the small golden key. It turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled in, anticipation of this moment. The chest's lid opened to reveal neatly organized contents, logbooks dating back to the lighthouse's construction in 1872, a small collection of artifacts recovered from the shoreline over decades, and a leather portfolio secured with a faded ribbon. This last item caught Elizabeth's attention immediately. Her name was written across it in her father's precise engineer's script. She untied the ribbon and opened the portfolio to find dozens of letters, each in its own envelope, each addressed to her but never sent. The dates spanned the 27 years of their estrangement, with the most recent written just weeks before Thomas's death. He wrote to me every month, Elizabeth whispered, rifling through the envelopes. For almost 3 decades. Beneath the letters lay a thin manuscript bound with twine, titled simply The Catherine Chronicles. Elizabeth opened it to find her father's account of his life with her mother, their courtship, marriage, scientific collaborations and adventures at sea. He had documented Catherine's research, her discoveries, her passions and quirks, preserving in intimate detail the woman who had been lost too soon. "This is his gift to you," Margaret said softly. "Not just his own story, but your mother's as well. He kept her alive in these pages." Elizabeth clutched the manuscript to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "All these years, I thought holding on to my anger was honoring her memory. Instead, I was the only one who stopped remembering her as she truly was." Cooper whined softly, nudging aside the remaining contents of the chest to reveal a final item tucked into the bottom corner, a small, worn leather case. Elizabeth opened it to find an antique compass, its needle still pointing faithfully north despite its age. "Mum's compass," she breathed. "She took it on every research expedition. It was never recovered after the accident. How did he find it?" An envelope beneath the compass case provided the answer. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping reporting the discovery of debris from Catherine's research vessel washing ashore nearly 50 miles north of the accident site, 3 years after her death. A local fisherman had found the compass tangled in his nets and, recognizing the Whitfield name engraved on the back, had returned it to Thomas. "The sea gives back what it can," Elizabeth read from her father's notation on the clipping. "Not enough, never enough, but something to hold on to." The three of them remained in the lantern room as midnight approached, Elizabeth reading excerpts from the letters and manuscript, sharing with Margaret the family history that had been preserved despite the fracture between father and daughter. Cooper settled contentedly at their feet, his mission clearly nearing completion. In a letter dated on Elizabeth's 40th birthday, Thomas had written, "I watched from a distance today as you argued before the federal court in Boston. The case involved industrial pollution of coastal waters. Your mother's life's work continued through you. You spoke with such conviction, such clarity of purpose. Catherine's passion and my precision united in our daughter. I have never been prouder, nor felt more invisible." Another, written shortly after the birth of Elizabeth's second son, read, "Your boy has Catherine's eyes, that same curious gaze that seemed to look straight through to the heart of things. I stood in the hospital corridor as your husband brought him to the nursery window, a stranger admiring a new life when I am the grandfather he may never know. Still, I am grateful for the glimpse, for the continuation of our family's story, even if my chapter in it has ended." As dawn approached, Elizabeth finally closed the portfolio, her expression transformed by the night's discoveries. "He never stopped loving me," she said, her voice stronger now. "Never stopped being my father, even when I rejected him. Some bonds can't be broken," Margaret replied, "only stretched across distance and time." They descended the lighthouse stairs as the first light of morning painted the eastern horizon in shades of pearl and gold. Cooper led the way, no longer the vigilant messenger, but simply a dog returning home with his family. In the cottage kitchen, Elizabeth prepared coffee while Margaret set the table for breakfast, the domestic routine feeling surprisingly natural after their night of revelations. Cooper settled in, his spot by the door, watching them with contented eyes. "I've made a decision," Elizabeth announced as they sat together in the gentle morning light. "I'm taking a sabbatical from my firm, 6 months, possibly a year." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "To stay here, to restore this place, not just the buildings but the legacy." Elizabeth's gaze moved around the cottage, seeing not just what was, but what could be. "Dad protected this lighthouse for decades. I want to ensure it continues, perhaps as an educational center for marine conservation. Something that honors both my parents, Mom's scientific work and Dad's dedication to this place." "A worthy project," Margaret said warmly. "Your father would be proud." "And I've been thinking about you, Margaret," Elizabeth continued, a hint of hesitation in her voice. "This cottage has plenty of room. If you wanted to stay longer, to help me sort through Dad's papers, perhaps, you'd be very welcome." Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest, not the loneliness that had been her constant companion for years, but its opposite, the unexpected gift of being needed. Before she could respond, Cooper rose and came to sit between them, looking from one woman to the other with expectant eyes. "I think Cooper has an opinion on the matter," Margaret laughed, stroking his silky head. "He's been right about everything else so far," Elizabeth smiled. "Perhaps we should trust his judgment." Outside the window, the lighthouse stood against the brightening sky, its beam no longer visible in the morning light, but its presence no less powerful. Inside, 2 women and a dog who had brought them together sat in companionable silence, contemplating new beginnings born from long-delayed endings. Autumn painted Cape Harmony in rich amber and gold as September yielded to October. The maple trees lining the path to the lighthouse blazed with color, their fallen leaves crunching underfoot as Margaret made her daily walk from the cottage to the village post office. 3 months had passed since she had first followed Cooper to this windswept peninsula. What had begun as a few days' visit had gradually evolved into a more permanent arrangement. "Another box of books from Oakwood?" asked Harriet Jenkins, the postmistress, as Margaret collected the package waiting for her. "The last of them, I think," Margaret confirmed. "My tenant is settling in nicely." The change had happened so organically that Margaret sometimes marveled at her own adaptability. The offer to stay at Cape Harmony had extended from days to weeks, until finally Elizabeth had made a suggestion that had seemed both outlandish and perfectly reasonable. Why not rent out her Oakwood house and become a permanent resident at the Lighthouse Cottage? At 73, Margaret had never expected to uproot her life so completely, yet the decision had brought an unexpected sense of rightness, of pieces falling into their proper places. "You're famous now, you know," Harriet said with a wink, handing Margaret the local newspaper. "The Lighthouse ladies and their remarkable dog. The Historical Society can't stop talking about your restoration project." Margaret smiled, tucking the newspaper under her arm. "Elizabeth is doing the real work. I'm just the designated archivist." This was true, but understated her role. While Elizabeth focused on the legal aspects of establishing the Thomas and Catherine Whitfield Marine Education Center, Margaret had taken charge of cataloguing Thomas's extensive collection of journals, photographs, and maritime artifacts. Her background in library science, unused for decades, had proven invaluable for the project. Cooper trotted at her side as she walked back to the cottage, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents along the way. The change in him was as remarkable as the changes in the 2 women. No longer the solemn messenger bearing a heavy responsibility, he had blossomed into a playful, affectionate companion, though he still maintained his dignified bearing when the occasion called for it. The cottage had transformed as well. Elizabeth had spent weekends stripping old wallpaper, repainting rooms, and updating the kitchen while preserving its vintage charm. Photographs once hidden in Thomas's study now hung proudly throughout the house, a visual timeline of 3 generations of Whitfields. Elizabeth had added recent photos of her sons, both of whom had visited during their summer break, bringing youthful energy and curiosity to the quiet peninsula. As Margaret approached the cottage, she heard voices on the porch, Elizabeth's, and a deeper, masculine tone she recognized as belonging to Dr. James Sullivan. The retired physician had become a frequent visitor, initially checking on Cooper's health but increasingly finding reasons to drive up from Oakwood. Margaret smiled to herself, recognizing the signs of a courtship unfolding between the doctor and Elizabeth. "Margaret, just in time for lunch," Elizabeth called, waving her up the steps. "James brought that seafood chowder you like from Harrison's." "A peace offering," the doctor added with a grin. "I've been interrogating Elizabeth about the educational center plans again. He's convinced we should include a small medical exhibit," Elizabeth explained, rolling her eyes fondly. "The history of maritime medicine, treatments for scurvy and whatnot." "Not a bad idea," Margaret noted, setting her package down. Thomas's journals mentioned several medical emergencies at the lighthouse over the years. They settled around the porch table, Cooper taking his customary place at Elizabeth's feet. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of an approaching vehicle. Moments later, a taxi appeared on the narrow road leading to the lighthouse. "Are we expecting someone?" Margaret asked, surprised. Visitors to Cape Harmony were infrequent, especially on weekdays. Elizabeth shook her head, rising to her feet as the taxi stopped and its passenger emerged, a young man in his early 20s, carrying a backpack and looking around with uncertain eyes. Cooper was on his feet immediately, tail wagging with sudden enthusiasm. "Can we help you?" Elizabeth called, descending the porch steps. The young man approached, his expression hesitant but hopeful. "I'm looking for Elizabeth Campbell, and possibly Margaret Wilson. My name is Michael Whitfield." Elizabeth froze. "Whitfield? Thomas Whitfield was my grandfather," the young man explained. "On my father's side. I've been trying to locate him for a genealogy project, only to discover he passed away earlier this year." He swallowed hard. The Historical Society in town said you might be able to tell me about him. Cooper had already crossed the distance between them, greeting the visitor with enthusiastic familiarity, despite never having met him before. Michael knelt to stroke the dog's head, a smile breaking across his face. "You must be Cooper," he said softly. "Dad told me grandfather had a dog named Cooper, said he was the smartest dog in New England." Margaret watched as Elizabeth's composure faltered, tears filling her eyes. "Your father knew Thomas? How is that possible?" Michael straightened. "They corresponded for years. Dad's an oceanographer. He reached out to grandfather about 20 years ago after reading some of his technical papers on wave patterns. They discovered the family connection by chance." His expression grew uncertain. "Dad always wanted to arrange a meeting, but grandfather insisted the time wasn't right. Something about respecting someone else's feelings." "Mine," Elizabeth whispered. "He was respecting my feelings." She extended her hand, which trembled slightly. "I'm Elizabeth Campbell. Thomas Whitfield was my father." Michael's eyes widened. "You're my aunt." "Dad never mentioned—" "He probably didn't know," Elizabeth said gently. "My father and I were estranged for many years. A family. Rift that should never have lasted as long as it did." The young man's face brightened with understanding. "So we're family. Actual family." "Yes," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking on the simple affirmation. "Very much so. And you have cousins. My 2 sons are about your age." For a moment no one spoke. Cooper moved between them, his tail sweeping gently back and forth, as if pleased with this final, unexpected connection he had helped to forge. "Would you like to come inside?" Margaret finally offered. "There's plenty of chowder, and I believe Elizabeth has 1,000 questions for you." "And I have photos," Michael added eagerly, patting his backpack. "Of Dad, my sisters, your brother's family, Elizabeth." "My brother," Elizabeth repeated, the word strange on her tongue. "I have a brother." As they moved toward the cottage, Cooper bounded ahead, leading the way with the confident air of one who had fulfilled his purpose beyond all expectations. Margaret lingered behind, watching as Elizabeth placed a tentative arm around her newly discovered nephew's shoulders, already pointing out features of the lighthouse as Thomas would have done. Later that evening, after Michael had departed with promises to return soon with his father, Elizabeth's unknown brother, Margaret sat on the porch swing with Cooper beside her, watching the lighthouse beam cut through the gathering dusk. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she murmured to the dog. "That bringing Elizabeth home was just the beginning." Cooper rested his chin on her knee, his amber eyes reflecting the wisdom that had guided them all to this moment. Whatever secrets he still kept, whatever understanding he possessed that transcended human comprehension, he seemed content now. His mission, begun with an old man's final wish and a leather pouch attached to a worn collar, had expanded beyond anyone's imagination. Elizabeth joined them, settling on Margaret's other side. "I spoke with Robert, my brother, on the phone," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's coming next weekend. Says he's been waiting to meet me his entire life." "Your father orchestrated quite a reunion," Margaret observed. "Through Cooper," Elizabeth agreed, reaching across to stroke the dog's head. Dad knew exactly whom to trust with his most important message. The 3 of them sat together as darkness fell completely, bound by a journey that had begun with a sad-eyed dog appearing at a garden gate. Margaret thought of her orderly life. In Oakwood, the careful routine she had built around her solitude, how swiftly it had dissolved in the face of Cooper's silent plea, replaced by something far richer. This improvised family, this shared purpose, this cottage by the sea, where broken pieces were being mended with each passing day. Cooper sighed contentedly, closing his eyes as the women continued their quiet conversation. Inside the lighthouse, the great Fresnel lens rotated in its timeless rhythm, sending its beam across the darkened water, not just guiding ships to safety, but illuminating the path home for all who had lost their way. In the morning, they would continue their work, cataloguing artifacts, planning exhibits, responding to Michael's revelations. New photographs would join those on the cottage walls. New voices would fill rooms too long shrouded in silence. The circle that Thomas Whitfield had begun to draw in his patient, lonely vigil would expand to include generations he had never expected to unite. And Cooper, having carried his secret across miles and years, would be there to witness it all, no longer a messenger, but the living heart of a family reborn from the truth he had so faithfully guarded. My friends, we have reached the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.